They said the Hercules was finished, too old, too heavy, too slow to face the storm. Commanders shook their heads, soldiers whispered that no pilot alive would dare take her up again. But that night, when the skies ripped open and the mission was already declared impossible, one woman stepped forward. Helmet in hand, jaw set, eyes locked on the horizon. They didn't know her name. They only knew the code name whispered like a prayer across battlefields long past. Storm Angel. Welcome back to the Storyscape, where we bring you cinematic tales of courage, impossible missions, and heroes who refuse to be forgotten. If you're new here, take a moment to subscribe and join our growing community. And tell me, where are you tuning in from tonight? Are you watching from a small town in Texas, a busy city like New York, or maybe somewhere halfway across the world? Drop your location in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The desert airfield had a way of swallowing sound. Even when engines roared on the far side, even when mechanics shouted across hangars, there was a hush that clung to the runway at the edge of the base. It was the kind of quiet born from things left behind. At the far corner, past rows of polished fighters and helicopters that still carried tomorrow's missions, there sat a relic, a C-130 Hercules, its paint sun-faded, its wings scarred with patches of corrosion, its wheels half sunk into the baked earth. Birds nested in the edges of its tail. Oil stains marked the ground like old blood that no one had bothered to scrub away. They called it finished, too old, too heavy, too slow. Every briefing, every logbook had written it off years ago. Mechanics joked about cannibalizing its bones for spare parts. Commanders spoke of replacing it with newer aircraft that looked sleeker, faster, more advanced. To the soldiers walking past, it was nothing but an artifact of another war, something you saluted once out of habit, then forgot. But there was something about the way it sat there, nose forward, shark-mouth grin faded but not erased, as if it was waiting, watching. The men didn't speak of it openly, but when shadows grew long in the evening and conversations drifted, someone always brought it up. They whispered about the missions it had flown, the men it had carried home when no other bird would land. They whispered about the storm that had nearly torn it apart years ago, and the pilot who refused to let it fall. That story had no photographs, no official report, just a name, a call sign, Storm Angel. It wasn't the kind of name you wrote on a roster. It was the kind that passed between soldiers in half-believing tones, the kind that lingered long after the battle was over. Nobody admitted to knowing who she really was. Some said she had vanished into training commands, locked away behind paperwork and desk duty. Others believed she had left the service entirely. But the name never faded. And now, there she was. At the edge of the runway, framed against the glaring sun, a woman stood in silence. Her flight suit clung to her frame, the green fabric sharp against the desert gold. She wasn't posing, she wasn't making a show. She simply stood with her helmet under one arm, her eyes narrowed at the horizon, as if reading the air itself. Soldiers moving nearby slowed without realizing it. Two young mechanics carried a toolbox past her and whispered when they thought she couldn't hear. "That's her." "No way, she's too young." "You think the stories lie?" the other muttered back. The woman didn't turn. She didn't acknowledge them at all. But the Hercules behind her seemed to answer for her. Sunlight caught the edge of its nose, glinting off the faded shock mouth that still looked hungry. The air shimmered in heat waves, and for a moment the old transport didn't look broken. It looked alive. Commanders had dismissed it 100 times. Not airworthy, not worth the fuel, not worth the risk. And yet, here she stood, as though every piece of paperwork meant nothing. She wasn't waiting for clearance. She wasn't waiting for orders. She was waiting for the storm.
And far beyond the mountains, beyond the clear horizon, weather was already forming. The kind of weather no modern aircraft would dare enter. The kind of weather that demanded more than sleek speed or fancy avionics. It demanded stubborn metal, wings built like bones, and a pilot who knew how to thread chaos like it was natural second. The kind of pilot who had earned a name whispered like a prayer. Storm Angel. No one said it out loud now, but every soldier who caught sight of her thought it. Some with awe, some with disbelief, a few with quiet hope. Because deep down, they all knew the truth. When everything else failed, when the mission collapsed and the storm closed in, legends didn't retire. Legends waited. And the Hercules, its frame weathered, its engine silent, looked as if it had been waiting too. The storm didn't arrive all at once. It crept in slow, a bruise spreading across the horizon. By late afternoon, the wind had shifted, tugging grit across the runway in thin streams. Dust scratched against metal hangar walls and stung the eyes of men who had been in deserts long enough to think themselves immune. Radio chatter grew sharp with urgency. On the far edge of the operations tent, a map lay pinned under coffee mugs and grease-stained wrenches. Little markers clustered around a canyon line that cut through the mountains like a wound. That was where the unit was trapped. 24 men pinned by terrain and enemy fire, with a storm rolling over them like a curtain no one could tear down. Helicopter attempts had already failed. The wind threw their rotors like toys, slammed them sideways until their pilots limped back smoking.
Fast movers screamed overhead. Useless. Sleek jets weren't built for valleys that narrow, storms that savage. They needed cargo wings. They needed endurance. They needed a machine that wasn't afraid to scrape the edge of the earth. And there it was, on the edge of the runway, written off as dead. "The Hercules is grounded," the operations chief said flatly. His voice carried the tired weight of someone who had repeated the same line too many times. He tapped the logbook. "Engine stripped, airframe fatigue. She won't hold up." "You want me to tell them that?" A younger officer snapped, jabbing a finger at the map. "That we let them die because the bird's too old?" The room fell quiet. The only sound was the wind rattling canvas walls and the low growl of distant thunder. Someone muttered under their breath. Not a suggestion, not a plan, just a name. Storm Angel. It hung there in the air, heavier than the storm outside. Men shifted uncomfortably. Some scoffed. Others looked down at their boots. "That's not an option," the chief said, too fast, too defensive. But outside, past the tent flaps and the fuel trucks and the lines of modern aircraft that were all but useless, she was already moving. Catherine Munro walked with the kind of pace that ignored doubt. Helmet in hand, boots crunching on gravel, her eyes never left the horizon. She'd heard the chatter, the dismissals, the warnings. She'd heard them all before. And yet here she was, headed straight toward the aircraft everyone had abandoned. The Hercules loomed larger the closer she came. Its shark-mouthed grin seemed sharper in the low sun, teeth flashing as the light caught edges of peeling paint. Dust swirled around its tires. Heat shimmer rose from the tarmac, and for a second it looked like the giant was breathing. She stopped at its nose, laying one gloved hand against the faded metal. The surface was hot, radiating the desert sun and the memory of countless flights. She remembered them all. Strips no wider than dirt trails, nights when storms tore the sky in half, days when men thought they wouldn't make it out alive until the Hercules opened its belly and swallowed them whole. Behind her, voices carried across the ramp. Two mechanics, young, uncertain. "She can't be serious. They said it wouldn't fly." "They said a lot of things," another voice cut in, older, gruffer. A crew chief, arms folded, eyes narrowed.
He'd seen her before, not on paper, not in briefings, but in the kind of moments men remember with silence instead of words. He didn't step forward, didn't salute. He just watched. Inside the operations tent, the argument raged on. We can't risk it. She won't even clear the runway. We don't have a choice. Then find another way. There isn't another way. The radio crackled, sharp and raw. A voice came through. Hoarse, breathless, but steady. One of the trapped men.
Contact heavy. Position holding. Ammo low.
Then static.
No one spoke for a long moment. The storm was closer now, thunder rolling across the desert like a drumbeat. The commander rubbed a hand over his face. If she tries and fails, we lose more than a plane. We lose her. Someone else whispered, we already lost them if we don't try. Outside, Catherine's hands still rested on the old Hercules, her head bowed as if listening to the storm, to the machine, to memory. When she looked up, her eyes weren't on the men arguing behind her. They were on the mountains, where dark clouds gathered like an army. The Hercules had been silent for years, but some things don't stay dead. Not when men are still out there waiting. Not when storms rise that only certain hands can navigate. She let her helmet fall into place, locking with a sharp click. The visor caught the sun, a flare of gold against the deepening dusk. And without a word, she climbed the ladder into the cockpit. The giant stirred. The cockpit smelled like old metal and dust. For years it had been nothing more than a shell, a hollow chamber where manuals gathered cobwebs and seat cushions stiffened in the heat. Now, with the canopy pulled shut, it felt alive again. Catherine slid into the left seat, strapping in with practiced hands. Every motion carried memory. Switches under her fingertips weren't relics, they were promises waiting to be kept. She pressed the first set of toggles, and the cockpit responded with a low electric hum. Panels flickered, reluctant at first, then steady. The Hercules wasn't just waking up, it was recognizing her. Outside, a crew of mechanics jogged up, shouting protests. "Ma'am, she's not certified. Systems aren't cleared." Their voices fell away when the first engine coughed. A plume of black smoke spat from the exhaust, followed by a rumble deep enough to vibrate through the tarmac. The mechanics froze, tools dangling in their hands, eyes wide. One engine, then two, then three. By the time the fourth turbine caught, the airfield shook with the sound of rebirth. The Hercules growled like an animal remembering its strength, the shark mouth painted on its nose, grinning wider under the blazing sun. In the control tower, the operations chief nearly dropped his headset. "She actually lit them up." The commander leaned forward, jaw tight. "She won't clear 30 seconds in that storm, mark my words." On the ground, soldiers stopped what they were doing. Fuel crews, security details, even the cooks carrying trays across the mess hall paused to listen. Everyone knew that sound. It was the same voice that had carried them into combat zones and out again. Deep, steady, fearless. The Hercules wasn't pretty. It wasn't fast. But when it spoke, men trusted it. The crew chief, old, scarred, arms folded, watched from the edge of the tarmac. He muttered under his breath, almost like a prayer.
"Storm Angel, you're really gonna try it." Catherine's voice came through the radio at last, calm, even. "Tower, this is Hercules 2-1. Systems check green, requesting clearance for immediate departure." Silence. Then, "You don't have clearance, Major. That bird isn't airworthy." Her reply cut through the static. "Copy that. Rolling anyway." Hands slammed against desks in the tower. Orders barked. Curses flew. But down on the runway, the decision had already been made. Catherine eased the throttles forward. The Hercules shuddered, its frame groaning. but the engines dug in with a roar that rolled across the desert like thunder. Dust plumed behind the propellers, shimmering under the hot sun. The soldiers nearby felt it in their chests, a vibration, a weight. Some of them grimmed despite themselves. Others just stared, unable to believe what they were seeing. The impossible was moving. The wheels started to roll, slow at first, dragging like an old warrior rising from the dirt. But momentum built, each second adding weight to the sound. The ground shook, the air rippled, and by the time the Hercules hit mid-runway, it was no longer a relic. It was fury on wings. "Gear up," Catherine whispered, voice steady as stone. The nose lifted. The shadow of the giant stretched long across the sand, swallowing the men who stood watching below. And then, with a final shove of thrust, the Hercules left the earth. It climbed into the golden light of the afternoon, wings wide against the desert sky. The shark-mouthed grin tilted upward, defying every page of paperwork that had called it dead. In the tower, no one spoke. In the operations tent, radios fell silent. Across the base, men and women who had written off the old bird now stood rooted to the ground, following its ascent with wide eyes. But the sky ahead wasn't forgiving. Beyond the clear stretch of desert, the storm loomed, dark walls of cloud rising like a fortress. Lightning flickered deep inside, illuminating veins of fury that twisted through the gray. Wind currents swirled, erratic and violent. Even modern jets had turned away. The Hercules didn't turn. Catherine leveled her climb, eyes locked on the storm. Every warning light on the dash blinked red in protest. Terrain alerts, wind shear warnings, stall cautions. She silenced them all with a flick of her fingers. Machines panicked when they saw the impossible. Pilots decided whether to listen. "Storm Angel?" A voice crackled over the comms. It was the younger officer from the operations tent. His tone carried awe, not authority. "Godspeed." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The Hercules plunged forward, its broad wings slicing through the calm blue and into the first fingers of turbulence. The clear golden light fractured into shadow, the horizon disappearing behind walls of cloud. Below, two soldiers still stood at the runway's edge.
Dust blew across their boots, their hands raised in salute long after the plane had vanished from sight. One lowered his hand at last, whispering to the other, "They said she couldn't fly again." The other smiled faintly, eyes still on the sky. "Then they don't know her." The first wall of cloud hit like a shoulder. The Hercules took it, flexed, and kept going. Catherine rode the bump with a small correction on the yoke, not overreacting, not letting the airframe chase the gust. The wind shoved from the right, a dirty, sliding force that wanted the wing to dip and the nose to wander. She gave it a touch of rudder, a breath of trim, and let the big bird settle back on the line she'd chosen. Storm flying wasn't a fist fight, it was a negotiation where only one side was allowed to raise its voice. Inside the cockpit, the familiar ancient symphony built around her. The hiss of conditioned air, the turbine whine settling into a low, steady thrum, the tick of instruments that other pilots trusted more than they trusted themselves. She read them all, but believed none of them on faith. Airspeed bled and then surged. The altimeter jittered a hair, not enough to scare her, just enough to confirm what she already felt through the column. Rotor wash trapped inside the cliffs and stair-stepped layers of shear stacked like invisible glass. She reached forward and set the propeller control to keep RPM nailed, eyes flicking across torque and TIT. The needles danced close to yellow. Not reckless, decisive. "Hold together," she said to the machine, not as a plea, but as an order to an old friend who sometimes needed the reminder. The Hercules hummed back.
4 discs of blackened metal carving tunnels in the wet air. Ahead, the canyon mouth gaped and then vanished as sheets of rain erased it, drew it again, erased it once more. If the evac was going to happen, it would happen on a strip that was never meant to be a runway. An old wadi, widened by trucks, a service road half-eaten by runoff, or a goat track flattened by desperate men with shovels. Whatever it was, it would not be straight, it would not be long, and it would not forgive mistakes. Her world narrowed to 3 distances: the next 10 seconds, the next 100 feet, the next decision. "Storm Angel, say position." The voice on the radio was thin, high with static, and holding itself together by grit. Not tower, not ops. One of the trapped men on a battered handset, the kind you cradle against your helmet when the wind is trying to throw your voice away. 2 minutes, she said, because that was the truth, and because any other number would make them listen for a miracle instead of preparing to help it happen. "Copy, copy, we've got oil and rags, we'll burn whatever we have left." Lightning spidered somewhere inside the cloud, so bright the cockpit flashed white and then fell back to the green glow of instruments.
The rain turned to needles, then fists. Catherine eased power a breath and nudged the nose a degree left, matching what the storm wanted without surrendering to it. The Hercules didn't slice, it shouldered its way forward, and the weather gave way, not out of respect, but out of physics. The first glimpse of the canyon came as a suggestion, a darker shade of gray against a field of gray, a line where the rain fell differently. Then it drew itself in, hard edges cut by runoff, slabs of ancient rock shining with the polish of water. She dropped a notch of flaps and felt the lift gather like muscle under skin. The air grabbed at the broad wings, shook them, and moved on. In the valley below, men ran with cans and torn shirts, building fire against wind that hated fire. Oil caught and tried to climb, sputtered, sank, and then took. A tongue of smoke twisted stubbornly against the rain. Someone cheered, someone else hissed at him to shut up and keep feeding it. The first rumble reached them, deep, layered, alive. Not thunder. Engines. "Is that—" a young voice started, and the team leader cut him off with a look that said, "Save the words for after." Catherine set her approach as if the canyon were a runway written on a chart. It wasn't. Corners bit into air, slopes fell away at the wrong places, and the line you wanted was never the one that matched the geometry of sane flight. She built her own line, sketched it with small motions, then committed to it with the kind of steadiness you couldn't teach in a sim. The Hercules responded by feeling bigger and lighter all at once, mass directed into a purpose narrower than its wings. Flaps 20, 30, she spoke to herself, to the machine, to the memory of every landing that had taught her where the edge lived and how far over it you could hang part of a wing without paying for it. She trimmed again, felt the nose want to wander, and gave it the smallest bite of rudder. The airspeed needle danced around a number she liked but didn't trust. She added 5 knots for gust, took 3 away when the canyon cut the wind, added 2 back because her bones told her to. The strip appeared, if you could call it that, like a bruise on the floor of the canyon, a smear of flat earth, pocked with standing water and bordered by rock waiting to punish arrogance. The fire marked one end. At the other, someone had dragged white canvas into a crooked line. It wasn't pretty, but it said runway the way a hand thrown up says stop. She took a breath and made the decision that turned myth into muscle memory. Gear down.
The thunk and whine came in sequence, blessedly normal in a place that had no use for normal. She set flaps 40. The Hercules swelled under her, a big, willing wing. The descent came on a rail she could feel in her teeth.
A gust rammed to the right side, hard enough to shove the nose toward the cliff. She held the crab, angled into the push, and didn't let the sight picture twitch. It was a trick that always felt like lying to the ground, insisting you were lined up when the nose said otherwise, until the last heartbeat when you straightened and the lie became truth. She waited for that heartbeat and then used it, slewing straight with a smooth, firm kick that put the wheels where her mind had placed them 10 seconds ago. TIT holding, torque steady. Numbers tried to sell panic. She bought only what she needed. The strip rose to meet her. Wheels kissed water and grit, then bit. The first second held. The second tried to slide. The third found friction and made it a promise. Catherine brought the power to flight idle and then passed it, pulling the props into beta as the discs went almost transparent. Reverse came in like a shout turned into hands, broad, open, stopping hands. The Hercules sat down with authority and then shook as puddle and rock argued under her tires. The rudder wagged once under a greedy gust. She caught it with a heel and toe and didn't let it start a conversation. She kept the roll, let ground speed bleed, and refused to look at the wall of rock coming faster than comfort liked. When the airframe told her the story she wanted, mass settling, momentum conquered, she eased the reversers out, brought the props back, and applied just enough brake to make the last 100 feet a quiet apology to the canyon for waking it up. They stopped with 20 yards to spare. No one in the valley breathed for a full second. "Welcome to the floor," she said to herself, throat dry, hands steady. Outside, the rain softened from knives to coins. They came out of the rocks at a run, faces blackened with soot and mud, eyes wild the way eyes get when the body is still catching up to the news that it lived. The team leader reached the cargo door and then stopped, because the person he found was not what he expected. He'd prepared for a ghost, an old legend, a rumor in a flight suit. Instead, there was a woman climbing down with her helmet tucked under her arm, visor up, rain silvering her lashes. She didn't look at him yet. She looked at the strip, measuring departure against the water pooling under wheel wells and the wind still playing games with the canvas markers. "Load light and fast," she said, and her voice carried without a shout. "No heroics. We make weight, we make sky." He nodded because there was nothing else to do in the presence of a plan that matched the shape of survival. He turned and began to move men the way you move them when you've been moving them for years. Short words, pointed hands, the authority of someone who has earned the right to use few syllables. Packs went aboard. A wounded man was handed up and then rolled gentle onto deck. Ammunition cases that would make the next ridge possible landed near the ramp, then were shoved further inside as more boots hit aluminum.
The wind threw a tantrum. The strip shivered under sheeted rain. Catherine walked the line under the wing, dragging a palm along the nacelle as if the engine could feel it. She crouched to look at the nose gear squat in the mud, calculated and then recalculated what reverse would give back if water cut friction again. The numbers said maybe. Her bones said yes, if you take what the gust offers and none of what it promises. "Storm Angel!" the radio whispered against her ear. Ops again, strangled by weather and distance and a fear that smelled like helplessness. "Say status." "On deck," she said. 2 minutes. 2 minutes meant forever, in a place where time had been measured in heartbeats for the last hour. Men moved differently when the number was small. They made fewer mistakes. They hesitated less. They understood that the next life saved was their own in a way that didn't need metaphors. A boy, he looked like one anyway, though the dirt and the lines around his eyes tried their best to pretend otherwise, paused at the ramp. He glanced up through the rain at the shark mouth, grinning down, and then at her. "They said she couldn't fly again," he said, as if repeating it out loud might still make it true. "She heard them," Catherine replied, stepping past him to the cockpit ladder. "That's why she's angry." He smiled, a quick, astonished thing that looked borrowed from the life he'd get to return to if all of this went right. She strapped back in and looked once more at the numbers, and then past them, to the cliff faces and the way the rain braided the air over the low end of the strip. Departure would be theater if she made it theatrical, but it had to be simple. Power, roll, keep the nose honest, let the gust do the lifting it wanted to do as long as you didn't count on it. Flaps set where the wing loved them most. Reverse on standby in case the earth decided to own something it shouldn't. And then the part that never looked like anything from the ground. Belief turned into control forces turned into inches, inches turned into sky. She keyed the intercom, out of habit, out of respect for the bodies in back, even though there was no crew to answer. "Brace, we're going to make this place smaller." Her hands settled on the throttles. Outside, a pair of soldiers near the nose lifted their hands to their brows and held the salute as if anchoring the weight of everything that was about to happen. It wasn't ceremony, it was promise. She pushed the levers forward. The Hercules answered with 4 voices that made one. The strip threw water. The wheels rolled, and somewhere under the storm's roar, the canyon remembered the sound of faith turned into motion. The Hercules roared as Catherine drove the throttles through the detent, all 4 turboprops screaming into the storm. Spray burst up from the wheels as they hammered down the rough strip, flinging mud and water into a silver haze. The cargo deck groaned with the weight of the evacuees. Men braced against the ribbed fuselage, wounded cradled by their brothers. Ammo crates lashed down with straps that had seen better days. Every heartbeat carried the same question. Would the old bird leave the ground before the canyon wall demanded an answer? The nose wheel jolted hard left, hitting a rut carved by runoff. For an instant, the Hercules wavered, mass threatening to slide where steel and dirt disagreed. Catherine didn't flinch. She pressed right rudder, felt the massive bird obey, and drove her back to centerline. Power poured through her hands into the throttles, a steady push that dared the storm to argue. She wasn't fighting it anymore. She was forcing it to choose, move aside or be torn in half. Outside, the fire at the strip's end had nearly drowned in rain. Black smoke billowed weakly, whipped sideways by wind that hated order. But through it all, 2 men stood stiff in the downpour, rifles slung, boots planted in mud, arms raised in a salute that did not shake. They didn't care if she saw. They only cared that the bird did. For a heartbeat, Catherine's chest tightened. Not fear, not pride, but the kind of gravity only soldiers give each other when they know a machine has become more than metal. She said quietly, 50 knots, eyes cutting between instruments and the ghost of the runway vanishing underwater. The airspeed needle jittered, untrustworthy in the turbulence, but her bones knew the truth. The weight was shifting. The wing was remembering what it was built for. 80. The storm shoved from the side. She crabbed into it, jaw locked, steady as if the gust was an old rival who'd lost this dance before. Cargo shifted. She felt it in the frame. She adjusted trim, kept her hands soft but unyielding. One mistake in pressure, one nervous correction, and the canyon would own them all. 95. Rotate. She eased the yoke back, not forcing, not begging. The Hercules rose, tires spraying one last sheet of water before breaking free.
The earth tried to keep her, clinging with suction and weight, but the wings answered higher laws. The nose lifted, the main gear followed, and the strip dropped away beneath them. For a terrible second they hung too low. The cliff edge came fast, a wall of ancient rock waiting for arrogance. Men in back clenched fists and closed eyes. Catherine didn't blink. She pushed the throttles into the red, engines howling with a sound that shook the storm itself. Rain streaked across the windshield like tracer fire, and then the Hercules climbed. Not graceful, not clean, but inevitable. The shark-mouthed nose cleared stone by 20 feet, maybe less, and then the canyon floor fell away. The trapped soldiers on the ground cheered, their voices lost in thunder, their salute still frozen in the air long after the bird was gone.
Inside the cockpit, Catherine breathed once, slow and even, the way you breathe after stepping out of a fight still standing. She trimmed for climb, checked torque and TIT, and glanced at the altimeter. They were alive. The storm had lost. But storms don't surrender. The Hercules punched into the black above the canyon, rain hammering fuselage and wings like gunfire. Lightning split the horizon, white veins ripping the dark. Each flash lit the cockpit in stark contrast, her face set in focus, instruments glowing green, hands steady on the controls. She looked less like a pilot than a conductor commanding an orchestra of thunder and steel. "Storm Angel, say altitude," crackled the weak voice on the radio. It was Ops again, disbelieving, clinging to the idea that anyone could still be up there. "Angel 6, and climbing," Catherine replied, calm, even, as if taking a Hercules through hell was just another leg in the logbook. The call sign spread across the net before anyone thought to stop it. Storm Angel. It was repeated in the back, whispered like a prayer by men who had seen the ground take too many of their friends. It reached Ops, where worn-out controllers grinned despite the storm battering their own tower. It would reach farther still, carried in bars and bunkhouses, in hangars and mess halls, because legends don't need orders to march. She leveled the bird just long enough to let the load settle, then nudged it higher, threading between bruised clouds and lightning veins. The Hercules shook, rattled, and surged, but under her touch it was more than an airplane. It was a promise made metal, a promise that no storm, no canyon, no weight too heavy could break a pilot who refused to let go. Behind her, men leaned back against cold aluminum, some laughing with the kind of shock that only survival brings, others silent with tears mixing into rain still dripping from their gear. They didn't know her name, not yet, but they knew the code whispered through headsets and into memory: Storm Angel. And as the Hercules clawed higher into open sky, Catherine allowed herself one quiet thought, not spoken, not logged, not meant for anyone else. They said she couldn't fly again. Now, they'll never forget that she did. The storm broke apart behind her, shredded by the passage of the Hercules. Dawn was beginning to rise in the east, pale light slanting across a sky washed clean by rain. The world looked raw, reborn. Catherine held the yoke steady, leveling at 12,000 feet, the old bird breathing evenly now, like a veteran soldier who had survived yet another impossible night. In the cargo hold, the men had grown quiet. The chaos of departure had given way to something deeper, heavier. They sat among crates and stretchers, uniforms still dripping, hands trembling from the violence of the ride, but their eyes all turned forward, toward the cockpit, toward the woman they couldn't see but could feel. It wasn't relief alone that hung in the fuselage. It was reverence. On the ground, those who had watched from the runway still stood in the mud. The two soldiers who had saluted remained at attention long after the plane vanished, their arms aching, their boots sinking deeper, but neither lowering their hands.
Others joined them, one by one, until the line stretched across the field. Dozens of men and women, soaked to the bone, watching the storm's edge as though a piece of themselves had taken flight with her. In the tower, silence lingered. The operations chief set his headset down, throat tight. He had doubted, had barked, had dismissed the Hercules as nothing more than steel ready for scrap. Now all he could do was whisper, not into the radio, not for any record, but for himself, Storm Angel. The name traveled faster than any aircraft. By the time Catherine set course south, the code was already moving through channels, relayed in disbelief, retold in awe. Squadrons at distant bases would hear it. Pilots in mess halls would repeat it. Old mechanics with grease-stained hands would murmur it while running their palms over tired airframes, half expecting the old machines to wake under their touch. Legends spread like wildfire when they were born in truth. Catherine herself said nothing. She adjusted trim, checked her fuel calculations, and guided the Hercules with the same calm that had carried her through the storm. Her eyes stayed forward, steady, not seeking applause, not waiting for anyone's validation. She hadn't flown for glory. She had flown because no one else could. But deep inside, she knew what the name meant now. It wasn't just a call sign. It was a torch, a story that would outlive the moment, outlive the base, even outlive her. Storm Angel wasn't a woman or a plane. Storm Angel was the proof that when everything collapses, when the sky itself says no, someone will still rise, take the controls, and defy the impossible. As the Hercules droned on, sunlight finally touched its shark-mouthed nose, painting the steel and gold. The grin stretched wide against the sky, daring the horizon to test it again. In that light, the plane didn't look old. It didn't look forgotten. It looked eternal. And in the years to come, whenever someone told the story of the storm, the canyon, and the night the Hercules roared back to life, they would not ask about models or tail numbers. They would not ask about engines or weight ratios. They would only ask one thing. Was that the flight of the Storm Angel? And the answer would always be the same, spoken with pride, with awe, with gratitude from those who had seen her vanish into the clouds. Yes, she flew, and she never looked back.